All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the development of the respiratory and gastrointestinal systems of the fetus. So remember that there's going to be some overlap because we're going back and talking about each system. Sometime between weeks 4 and 17, the larynx, trachea, bronchi, lung buds all begin to form. So prior to week 4, there's not any kind of respiratory system that begins to develop, and it starts from the top and moves its way downward. Okay, so we have the larynx, and then the trachea, and then the bronchi, and then the lung buds develop. The lung buds don't have any alveoli. They cannot exchange gases yet. Between 16 and 24 weeks, we get bronchi and terminal bronchioles. So we get more and more and more branching, but we still don't have alveoli until we get toward the end of that. The pulmonary vessels form, so now we're getting blood flow to that area, but until close to somewhere between 22 and 24 weeks, they don't really have alveoli yet. So toward the end of this period, the alveoli begin to form. You have to have enough alveoli to exchange gases for viability. That happens around 22 to 24 weeks. These numbers may be a little bit off. There may have been a little bit of change because it's kind of hard to find more recent data, but at the time the book was published, survival rate at 22 weeks was about 5%. Approximately 1% of those 22 weekers would go on to have healthy long-term survival. So even at 22 weeks, if we have enough alveoli to exchange gases, the outcomes frequently are not good. So we really want to maintain pregnancy until much closer to term. At around 32 weeks, those alveoli start to develop a second type of alveolar cells. So type 1 alveolar cells exchange gases. Type 2 alveolar cells actually produce surfactant. And remember, when we talked about respiratory last semester, surfactant lines the inside of the alveoli and it decreases the surface tension. So remember the alveoli, when we have made the lung buds and then bronchi and then bronchioles, and eventually those bronchioles all terminate in an alveolus. Okay, so the lungs are made up of millions of little alveoli. It's a little like a balloon. And those balloons are surrounded by a network of capillaries where gas exchange can occur. Okay, so that balloon needs to be inflated with air when we breathe in. So breathe in, it inflates, breathe out, it deflates. Now, without surfactant, it deflates and it's hard to reinflate because the sides want to stick together with surface tension. Remember when you're maybe washing dishes and you get two cups of the same size that don't want to come apart because of surface tension? Those alveoli, if they collapse and there's no surfactant, they want to stick together so they stay collapsed. Okay, so surfactant inside that alveolus allows it to reinflate. So that begins around 32 weeks, and that's when survival tends to get better. Surfactant production gradually increases until it peaks at around full term. Decreased placental blood flow accelerates fetal lung development. So when you have a fetus that's not getting adequate blood flow from the placenta, their lung development actually speeds up, probably because of the effects of cortisol. So one of the things we can do if we anticipate premature birth is they actually give the mom an injection of corticosteroid, and that accelerates lung development. So if the mom's not getting enough placental blood flow, or the fetus is not getting enough placental blood flow, that actually will accelerate lung development. There are some conditions that slow fetal lung development. The most common one is maternal diabetes. So the mother has diabetes. Insulin actually counters the development of the ability to produce surfactant. So maternal diabetes actually slows down lung development. So we can have a full-term baby, and later you'll learn that if the mom has diabetes, the baby is actually more likely to be larger, but their lungs may be somewhat underdeveloped. Fetal respiratory movements start as early as week 11, and that's the chest wall expands and contracts. Those lungs are collapsed, but they may expand and contract some, okay? That develops the muscles that are needed for breathing after birth, because after birth, those muscles have to work all the time, not stopping. It also regulates lung fluid volume. So the lung fluid that is in the lungs, those breathing movements move it in and out of the passageways. So it regulates the volume of that fluid, but also moving that fluid in and out of the developing lungs expands the alveoli. So this is how lungs continue to develop. So if there's not enough amniotic fluid to allow for osmotic pressure to it allows for pressure to cause that lung fluid to move in and out of the lungs. If there's not enough amniotic fluid, actually slows down lung development. Lung fluid increases shortly before birth. And then when we get to the birth part, we'll talk about what happens to that lung fluid afterward. So that's the respiratory system. Now, the GI system. Around week 4, the embryo folds in and it incorporates part of the yolk sac. And that yolk sac becomes a primitive gut, which is basically just a tube. Then those, the different parts of that tube start to develop. The top part, the foregut, develops into the pharynx, the lower respiratory tract, the esophagus, the stomach, first half the duodenum, the liver, the pancreas, gallbladder. That all happens around week 5 or 6. So think about the top part of the GI tract. The midgut forms into like the rest of the small intestine, part of the large intestine. The midgut actually has a loop that becomes part of the umbilical cord. And then the hindgut becomes the last part of the colon, anal canal, bladder, urethra. So that primitive tube becomes all of those body parts that are part of different systems. Beginning around month 5, the fetus swallows amniotic fluid. The stomach empties and there's peristalsis, but nutrition and elimination needs are all met via the placenta. So the fetus doesn't have a need to use the intestine for nutrition and elimination. It's all just developing and gearing up and getting ready to work. Fetal waste products accumulate in the intestine. They become a substance called meconium. It's this thick, tarry, black, sterile material. Usually it's not passed until after birth. Now, sometimes we see meconium passed in the uterus, and that can mean one of two things. Three things. It can be because of pressure. If the baby's breached, they're more likely to pass meconium because of the pressure on the belly. It can be because of postdates. They just were in there long enough that their gut filled up enough that they went ahead and they passed meconium. Or it can be that the sphincter is relaxed because of hypoxia. So we watch for meconium. It's not an emergency, but it can cause some complications, and it can indicate some other complications. Normally that meconium is not passed until after birth. In about week 9, the fetus starts to store some glycogen in the liver, and weeks 26 to 30, this is really important, they start to store some brown fat that is used to maintain body temperature at birth. So during that time, we're building brown fat. What happens if the fetus is born during that time? They're going to have more trouble with temperature regulation because they didn't have time to build that brown fat. The GI tract is mature at about 36 weeks. Mature as in it's reached the state of maturity of a newborn. The newborn GI tract continues to mature over the first few years of life. Okay, so that's respiratory and GI. We're going to come back and talk about several more systems in the next lecture the next section because they're shorter.